Hi, everyone. It's 1 p.m. and so I'm going to get us started today. Thank you for joining. Today we're at Paueru Gai Dialogues number 4, Old Roots and New Relationships on Indigenous Lands. My name is Angela May. You may or may not have known me before as Angela Kruger, but I recently changed my name to Angela May. And I'm a member of Powell Street Festival's Advocacy and Outreach Committee. So sort of the Powell Street Festival representative here today, my job is to just quickly introduce myself, provide a land acknowledgement, and set the tone for our event together before finally introducing our official host, Jeff Masuda. So that's what I'm going to do. Just first, some thank yous and housekeeping notes. So this series is made possible thanks to financial support from HAPA Collaborative, SFU's David Lamb Center, Canada Council for the Arts, BC Arts Council, City of Vancouver, as well as individual donors and in-kind support from the Bulletin Magazine and Element IQ. And a few housekeeping notes, always the thing that we do now on with technology involved in our events so much more. So we'll be recording the guest presentations today, and these will be available on Powell Street's YouTube channel. You can turn off your camera if you're just an attendee. You can turn off your camera if you wish to remain private. And there will be a Q&A right after the panelists' presentations, discussion conversation. So please write your questions in the chat box if you have a question you want to submit for Q&A. And also I want to stress that today our priority is to hear from everybody during breakout groups. So we're inviting you into circle, but because of all of the constraints of technology and just our context today, we've asked our facilitators of those breakout groups to be a bit tough with time management. So apologies in advance, and I'm one of them, so yeah, apologies in advance. Should you wish to share more thoughts after the event concludes, we've set up a discussion page on Facebook, so you'll find that in the Paueru Gai Dialogues event page. And apologies to those of you who've heard me say this before, but a heads up that this event will work best if you ensure you're viewing your Zoom screen on speaker view. In order to set your Zoom screen to speaker view, if you're on a computer or laptop, click on the icon in the top right-hand corner of your screen and select speaker view in the drop-down menu that appears, or if you're on a mobile phone, simply swipe across the screen. And just another heads up that when I do eventually hand the reins over to Jeff, which I will do shortly, I promise, he's going to share a presentation. And when he does that, your screen will rearrange itself to accommodate his presentation. And in doing so, it might switch to a full screen mode, so the Zoom covering the entirety of your screen. And you can exit that full screen mode while staying in this Zoom call by simply clicking on the escape button on your keyboard. And when Jeff has shared his presentation and your screen has rearranged itself, the same rules apply for the speaker view things. The top right-hand corner, if you're on a computer or laptop, you'll be looking for side-by-side speaker view, and swipe if you're on a mobile phone. So those are our thank yous and housekeeping notes. To get back to introductions and tone setting, I'm going to keep my introduction relatively short, but I do want to highlight how what I do now is shaped by guidance from my grandparents. So I said my name is Angela May, and I'm Gosei, or 5th generation Japanese Canadian scholar, writer, and activist. And this work is informed to a significant extent by my maternal grandparents. Like me, my grandpa Ian Belcher was mixed, but unlike me, he grew up as a boy in the Downtown Eastside in a building called Ferreira Court at Hastings and Jackson. If you know the Downtown Eastside, it's above the small store with the sign that now says U2 Grocery in the window. My grandpa was never actually interned because his mother, Kime Belcher, who had married a British man, cited her Britishness by marriage to the RCMP officer when the officer arrived and refused to leave her home. By contrast, my grandma grew up in Steveston, and then because she was interned in Greenwood, but she now lives in Vancouver and has been integral to my work in the city, providing immediate needs, everything from shelter to dinners to love and encouragement. And so I said a moment ago that I sit on Powell Street's Advocacy and Outreach Committee. As many people here know, there are lots of committees and boards and working groups in the Japanese Canadian community, and at a certain point, you have to choose where you're going to dedicate your energy. I chose the Advocacy and Outreach Committee because I'm concerned with how Japanese Canadian history, culture, and politics impact the Downtown Eastside, sometimes for the better, but not always. And on the Advocacy and Outreach Committee, I've found a space where I can work within my community to grapple with those sometimes good and sometimes not so good effects. And when I say not so good effects, I'm being nice. I say not so good now here because I struggle to know how to talk about my anger and my frustration and confusion and the sense of discord and twistedness, these more complicated emotions in our community, in the Japanese Canadian community. What I'm actually trying to gesture towards when I say not so good impacts in the Downtown Eastside is the long, shameful, and frankly infuriating history of dispossession and displacement in Vancouver, all of which begins foundationally from European colonization of Indigenous peoples' lands, which in BC began, I think, as early as the 1790s, but continues today. Right now, I'm speaking from Tsawwassen territory in a town that stole Tsawwassen land and their name. And many of us are joining from Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Others I know are joining from elsewhere on different Indigenous peoples' lands. And for this reason, it's hard to give a land acknowledgement. Because how do we acknowledge all of this theft, all of this violence, and all of this survival of people and of the land itself? And the truth is that I don't know. So while I want to acknowledge the land, and while I can do so in the conventional sense, we are gathering today in digital space, but from lands around the world, which belong to Indigenous peoples, including in Vancouver, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I also want to suggest that these acknowledgements are not necessarily acknowledgements. We don't have to understand them as just acknowledgements. This one, for example, could be transformed from an acknowledgement to a call or even a call out. What, we might ask, are we doing here? I asked myself that question while writing this up, and it struck me that it's a fitting question for this particular gathering, because we're here, at least in the way that I see it, to call each other in for a welcome, and maybe sometimes to call each other out because we're gonna mess up. And so we gotta have ways to work in that calling in, calling out graciously. Basically, that work of calling in, calling out is what I do, or what I try to do in my scholarship and on the Advocacy and Outreach Committee and in other activist efforts in my everyday life. And so I was asked today to set the tone for this event, and I wanna ask you, can this be our tone? Just calling each other in and calling each other out. Are we ready to do that? And can we do it with respect and even with love? And can we do it generously? Because that's what I'm proposing, to let that be our tone for today. Because today we're talking about topics that matter in an urgent sense. Feelings are at the fore. This hits home hard. Housing, racial discrimination, ongoing dispossession. These are topics that for many of us are like really, really upfront. But for some of us, they're more upfront than for others, or closer or more immediate. For example, I'm connected to these issues as a Japanese Canadian person, but I'm housed. Talking about, say, racial discrimination and dispossession while I sit in a literal house, unworried, totally unworried about my ability to stay in this house, is not the same thing as talking about racial discrimination and dispossession from, say, a tent. So as we move forward together, let's be welcome, and indeed welcome each other. Let's call each other in, but let's also recognize that this ground is not just a literal ground that belongs to Indigenous peoples. It's also figurative ground, and it's uneven. It's our job to listen and discuss and to get connected with one another, even on these difficult and uneven grounds. Anyway, without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce to you our guest facilitator, Jeff Masuda, Dr. Jeff Masuda, really. Jeff is a person with whom I feel especially connected because he was my master's supervisor. So I can say from that close-up look that he's a brilliant thinker and speaker, and without a doubt, a leader in uncovering the relations between the Japanese Canadian and Downtown Eastside communities. But in his words, he's a Canada Research Chair and Associate Professor at Queen's University. He is Sansei, third generation, with ancestral connections to Powell Street, and is known for his lead role in establishing the Right to Remain. That's a research collective that supports the tenant-led movement to undo historically layered injustices of inadequate housing conditions in Vancouver's single-room occupancy hotels. So welcome, Jeff, and welcome everyone to Paueru Gai Dialogues number 4, Old Roots and New Relationships on Indigenous Lands. And please consider yourselves officially called in.
Well, Thank you, Angela. I'm just going to now endeavor to share the screen so that folks will have some nice images to look at as we move along. So hopefully the technical instructions that Angela just provided work out well for you all. And maybe use the chat function if anyone is having any problems with that. So here we go. Share desktop screen. Okay, that should now work. Okay, well, I'd like to thank, on behalf of myself and the panelists, thank all the organizers, certainly Angela, Emmy, Sammy, all the folks on my screen right here, Gawa, all of the volunteers who are going to be helping to facilitate today's conversation, and the sponsors as well that were mentioned earlier. As Angela said, I'm Jeff Masuda. I'm sitting over here in Kingston, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe territories. It's a beautiful afternoon, but I am very pleased to be among you today. I'm joined by Chris Livingstone, Doris Chow, and Justin Sekiguchi. All of them will introduce themselves following my presentation. So my job, I think, is a little bit humble. My job is to set the tone or set the context for today's dialogue about roots and relationships in the context of people like our panelists who have committed their lives to organizing for a better future in the Downtown Eastside. So I'll take about 15 minutes or so to provide that context about what we mean by roots and relationships. And we'll do things a little bit differently, I think, than in previous dialogues, because we're going to jump straight into an interactive discussion within our panel. And we'll also encourage Q&A on the fly, even while we'll take time for some specific Q&A following the panel session. So please do use feel free to use the chat function at your leisure as the conversation continues, so that your questions can be queued up in our list here. We're fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from our panelists today, from their experiences of living, working, and organizing in the community of the Downtown Eastside over many years. By my very rough estimate, I think it adds up to somewhere upwards of 50 years of combined organized experience among Doris, Justin, and Chris. That may not be super accurate, but that was my best guess. So for me to begin, I want to return to Angela's acknowledgement, and thank you, Angela, for the fulsome acknowledgement and setting the tone. We are today centering the rich history, culture, and knowledge of the peoples on whose land the Downtown Eastside now occupies, as well as the many Indigenous peoples from other nations who live, work, play, and pray in the Downtown Eastside, many of whom I've been fortunate myself to learn from and befriend. It's this continuous and firm rooting of Indigenous peoples on this land that is a testament less to the impacts of colonialism than to its limits. What I mean is that the rupture of colonization, this agenda to root out the original landholders from this land, despite best efforts, in fact, has failed, even while the land itself has been dispossessed time and time again and transformed for well over a century. The metaphor we're working with of roots and uprooting also speaks to how colonial ruptures in other parts of the world have brought a multitude of peoples from across and beyond Turtle Island to the Downtown Eastside. These people set down new roots time and time again over the past century and a half, along the way building the neighborhood we know today as the Downtown Eastside. Our panelists are themselves diversely rooted in the community, and the work they will share speaks both to old roots and also exemplifies this theme of new relationships. I think this is because while all three have been working for many years on common issues in the Downtown Eastside, as far as I understand based on my conversations with them, they have had limited opportunity to actually get to know each other, even if they know of each other. And that's not unusual in the Downtown Eastside. This dialogue is therefore an opportunity for all of us on the call today for new relationships on the panel and with you, the audience, to find power in new relationships, rooted in common interests, even while constantly undermined by vested interests that are imposed from the outside and that consistently seek to divide the community. The interest we wish to emphasize here, this colonial interest, is the colonial prize itself, that is the land. Land turned to property, land turned to housing, to ghetto, to Skid Road. Later, land turned to tourist attraction, to financialized commodity, to multi-million dollar buildings that are in fact on the precipice of collapse. So I hope that we will learn today how this same land has also steadfastly provided for the people who dwell on it, or rather who dwell with it, as shelter, refuge, a living room, or a community. In centering the land, I want to draw from Vancouver-based poet and scholar Rita Wong, who poses this question to the racialized peoples who organize for justice on Turtle Island. She says, what happens if we position Indigenous peoples' struggles instead of normalized whiteness as the reference point through which we come to articulate our subjectivities, that is, who we are? How would such a move radically transform our perceptions of the land on which we live? Now, as your host, my role is limited, and rightfully so. Unlike our panelists who are in the daily grind of organizing, I'm at a distance, both geographically, thousands of kilometers away from Vancouver, here in Kingston, and politically from my upper middle class academic perch as a university professor. But I will take a moment to provide a glimpse of my own roots and relationships, because I think that they have some relevance to today's conversation, as well as something in common with many of our audience members on the call today. I'm going to do so by dedicating my part in this discussion to two of the people pictured here, pulling roots as it happens, and setting down roots of their own on a sugar beet farm, 1,159.5 kilometers east of the Downtown Eastside in Vancouver, according to Google Maps, near McGrath in Southern Alberta, 1947. My Uncle Min and Auntie Kay are pictured third and second from right in this photo. They're joined by their parents and siblings, including my dad, who was 5 years old at the time and wearing the cap, carrying the beets to the left. He was only an infant at the time of his expulsion from the West Coast, and now he is the last of his generation, the Nisei, alive in my family. My uncle and aunt passed away this past December and March, respectively. COVID has prevented me from returning home to mourn with family, but my thoughts have been in Alberta, in this land, nonetheless. From the few stories I've been told about their lives before the war, I know that a place called Powell Street loomed large over their early childhood memories. My grandfather and his father lived and worked in the Downtown Eastside, spending perhaps years living at 368.5 Powell Street in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. My grandmother joined them in 1921, 100 years ago. Uncle Min and Auntie Kay were born within a few years. For a time, the young family lived and worked in the Old World Hotel. Not surprisingly, the only memory that was ever shared with me about their time here was playing on Powell grounds. Eventually, the family left Vancouver, moving to Shawnigan Lake on the island by the 1930s. Within the decade, they would find themselves back in the city, passing through Hastings Park before heading east to Alberta, never to return. As it happens, it was 33 years after their expulsion that I was born in Taber, Alberta, just a prairie handful of miles from McGrath. And by my calculation, at least, it was 33 more years, 2007, that I found myself in Vancouver, starting a career by learning from organizers and residents of the Downtown Eastside. At the same time, I discovered the Powell Street Festival, the historical connection of dispersed Japanese Canadians like myself to the neighborhood, a stranger to the local Japanese Canadian community, yet finding something strangely familiar about the place and the people as I discovered more about my own family's early Canadian roots and my own identity as a descendant of the uprooted generation. Now, 14 more years later, those of you on today's call who know me may know me from my academic persona as a participant in the Right to Remain collective, or its predecessor, Revitalizing Japantown, ? Here you see some snapshots of these relations over the years. On the left, our booth at the Powell Street Festival around 2015, a clip from my brother's film, The Right to Remain, taken on a panel with Roy Miki to my left. This was on Japanese Canadian redress, organized by Sherry Kajiwara's team at the Nikkei National Museum. Below that, a group of SRO tenants creating prayer plaques called Emma as expressions of solidarity between Japanese Canadians and residents of today living in SROs in the Downtown Eastside. This was an idea brought to us by Kathy Shimizu on the call here on my screen. It was at the first SRO convention at the Japanese Hall. And finally, a sharing circle at the Gallery Gachet, also co-organized by Kathy. I think the year was 2016, but I could be wrong. I lose count. On the right, the offices of the SRO Collaborator, which was formed soon after this convention. Both photos here were taken at a Right to Remain community gathering at Culture Saves Lives on Hastings Street. The bottom one showing block print making, supported by the We Press Collective. Yet another example of Kathy and her team's ever-present support for this work and the boundless creative genius of their collective. And finally, my good friend and mentor and colleague, Dr. Audrey Kobayashi, at another community workshop in 2018. Of late, our work is centered on supporting the mission of the SRO Collaborative, a powerhouse group led by longtime community organizer Wendy Peterson and her team, who've been making huge waves of late in advancing the case for improved living conditions for SRO tenants. Alongside us, as always, are the festival, the Nikkei National Museum, the JBJCCA, many leaders within the Japanese Canadian community, both elders, such as Grace Aiko Thompson, Judy Hanazawa, as well as less elder in age, including Angela and many others, students and activists who have come and supported this work over the years. Several other cultural human rights organizations have been involved, and most importantly, SRO tenants who inspire us all. Here's an image that is often used and will be familiar as a bookend of many stories about the fate of Japanese Canadians in Canada. These stories are often centered on our uprooting from a place, from Powell Street, and perhaps about our rerouting in other places like McGrath, for instance. But I want to pick another starting point for today's discussion, and it's a starting point that actually begins in the immediate aftermath of this image, of this event, and in the place where our roots were pulled. And so in honor of the festival which is hosting today's conversation, I would like us to start by gathering everyone together back on Powell Street, a place that is in the heart of both the Japanese Canadian community and the heart of the neighborhood today. I ask you to imagine yourself on Powell Street. You're looking south onto Oppenheimer Park, once Powell grounds where so many generations of children have played. Hopefully, there we go. Now, I know many of you have stood here before. You may be picturing a sunny day at the festival, as in the photo here taken from their website a few years ago. Or you might remember being among a gathering of neighborhood residents around a drum circle or a park bench. Your gaze might shift to the west to take note of the beautiful renovations done at the Old World Hotel, now called the Tamura Building. Today, that hotel is an SRO. It's a designation that recalls how this building and dozens of buildings like it in the Downtown Eastside were purpose-built to house single working class men living in congregate conditions, even if for a time they also housed families like the young Masudas. Now suddenly your gaze shifts back to the park, but this time something has changed. In fact, you have changed. You're no longer you. Your name is Andy Little, and you're the sports writer for the Vancouver Sun. The year is 1949, 7 years after the Japanese Canadians left town. As you gaze back onto Oppenheimer, you encounter a scene that compels you to write the following piece. And here I encourage the audience to read the text in full. Please take note that I blanked out the overtly racist terms that Little used to describe what he saw, but you may infer them on your own. And I will give everybody a minute to read this text. This article reveals many things. Certainly the racism of its author and his clear denial of the humanity of the area's inhabitants. It's also an awfully familiar tone that I think we hear in a lot of places and expressions about the Downtown Eastside today. Consider the disappearance that is unfolding in the park, the empty bowl of life, the departed dreams, the literal disappearance of the young Indigenous women in the sleeping street is an implicit hope for something new to awaken. This disappearance reveals to us how the colonial, the white supremacist vision for Vancouver that so many Indigenous, Japanese, Chinese, and other racialized Canadians experienced before the war carried on with vigor after the war. Little's article was written at a time when there was a perverse sense of optimism rooted in the assurance of a return, a reclamation, a repossession, a re-civilization, a revitalization, if you will, a rerouting of a white middle-class society on Powell Street, to be found in the clearance of the slum, the removal of an urban blight. This colonial white supremacist turn of phrase set a foundation for how the Downtown Eastside was to be seen and intervened upon for decades to come, right up to today. What was then the promise of a more civilized city, premised on an explicitly white settler frame of reference, may actually be seen in language that we're familiar with today: a civil city, a creative city, a vibrant city, or even a healthy city. Each implies a disappearance of its own kind among those who would not conform to its image. Now, this agenda of disappearance was not only committed against Japanese Canadians, of course, whereas the solution to Japtown was to transform the area north of Hastings into an industrial district, as seen in the pink area of this 1957 city plan. The green area, Strathcona, would see the city targeting what was by then a multi-ethnic neighborhood of low-income residents, about half of whom by mid-century were Chinese Canadian families. This part of the vision for the Downtown Eastside was to replace the blighted housing of Strathcona with tidy blocks of shiny new subsidized housing in modern apartment buildings. As it turned out, the problem with this vision was that it was entirely paternalistic, culturally inappropriate, and unwelcome for the residents of Strathcona. And this is where a more important story emerges about this period and everything since then than the story of the racist policymakers and their ambitious plans. These early plans for Strathcona and the wider Downtown Eastside turned out to be a critical moment, as it marked the beginning of what would become a permanently embedded oppositional force that arose from within the community and ultimately stopped the city in its tracks. It was a moment orchestrated in large part through the stubborn resistance of activists representing the area's residents and small businesses in Strathcona and Chinatown, who by the late 1960s had formed the Strathcona Property Owners and Tenants Association, or SPOTA. It's important, though, to acknowledge, as scholar Joanne Lee has made clear, this campaign mounted by SPOTA was far more than a two-way conflict in defense of a Chinese neighborhood. Rather, it was a campaign that represented the whole community, and it was driven, often largely behind the scenes, by a multiracial, multi-ethnic group represented disproportionately by women that included Chinese, Italian, Black, and indeed white British working class families, who, to quote Dr. Lee, cleverly deployed everyday social practices, hospitality, food traditions that Canadians of mainly Chinese and Italian backgrounds traditionally used for cultivating kinship relations, forging social ties, melded with traditional political lobbying practices, and transformed a heretofore relatively powerless community group into one that was hugely influential. This example of SPOTA set an important, but I would suggest vastly underappreciated precedent for a relational approach to organizing that was not only suitable for the uniquely diverse community that had developed in the latter half of the 20th century, but absolutely necessary to face the challenges that would come with the increasingly harsh, punitive approaches that governments would begin to take in the Downtown Eastside by the 1980s. In this difference between the vilification of wider Vancouver and the lived realities of residents of Strathcona, Chinatown, and the remains of Paueru Gai, we find the makings of a diverse coalition tied by common roots, shared histories of persecution, and yet made powerful when it comes together in ways that cut across race, class, and gender. The early precedents in Strathcona set an example to be followed, perhaps not always faithfully, for decades, first by the Downtown Eastside Residents Association beginning in the 1970s, which was a group that had very close ties, in fact, to the founders of the Powell Street Festival. More recently, by organizations like the SRO Collaborator. Despite many differences in constitution, tactics, and successes and failures, the force of community organizing from within the Downtown Eastside has proven time and time again its capacity to stand against the continued campaign to transform the neighborhood that has come under so many guises over the years. Whereas long ago, transformation was forced through riot, expulsion, slum clearance. In more recent times, it's become a softer kind of violence, appearing in the form of paternalistic planning and cultural spectacle, whether Expo 86, the 2010 Olympics, or an imagined heritage district for Chinatown and a so-called Japantown that reduces culture and history to a retail mirage. Such transformations bear no resemblance to the reality of racialized working class history that runs thick through this neighborhood. But above the cacophony of urban plans and market forces, we hear the voices coming from within the community who remind us to be mindful of who is speaking in such plans and who is spoken over, who is made to disappear such that something new can appear. Such diversity of community and such organizing know-how across so many groups who call the Downtown Eastside home, whether by residence or by ancestry, offers an opportunity for a richer narrative of what decolonization, or to borrow a term from Joanna Lee, decolonize Asian can mean. The writing of the story is far from complete and it's far from easy. As Lee cautions, the deliberate erasure of racialized and Indigenous peoples and their histories, their shared histories, from narratives about Canadian nation formation ensures that knowledge about resistance and tactics of survival among activist elder leaders from these communities has not been articulated, never mind documented. And this brings us to the present moment, which is the opportunity to articulate what our elders have taught us about how to organize on Indigenous lands across lines of so-called differences, differences that are delineated by a white colonial frame of reference. This comes at a time when the stakes are higher than they've ever been. The housing crisis, the toxic drug supply crisis, and of course, the COVID crisis are all hitting the neighborhood at once. In this last slide, we're back on Powell Street with a view of Oppenheimer Park that appeared in the Tyee only 2 weeks ago. It would be the same scene as if you were there today. It is a precious community space, fenced off for the past 11 months, closed to both festival and to the unhoused alike in an attempt to undermine the solidarity that has come from these groups so many times before. But despite this intrusion, the past year has seen this well-oiled machine of organizers mobilizing nonetheless, not only to support their neighbors' most basic needs, housing, food, harm reduction supplies, culture, and dignity, but also to call for collective action against the deeply rooted colonial injustice that are common to all three crises. This organizing, the organizers, transcends community diversity. In its place, a solidarity that grows out of the long and strong roots of this community. And as Japanese-Canadian elder Grace Aiko Thompson speaks to here, the exploration of our roots, whether through festival, through dialogue, or through mutual support in a pandemic, is also an invitation into a common history. So now we'll turn to who our panelists are and the perspectives they can offer to what's happening on the ground today. So the discussion will proceed in 4 parts, each about 10 to 15 minutes max, and I will do my best to play timekeeper. We'll ask each of the panelists to begin with some comments about their roots, their thoughts on uprooting, on community rootedness, and common roots. Those are the sort of topics for the discussion. As I mentioned before, I will begin with a facilitated question. If audience members have questions, put them in the chat box, and I will be peeking at that from time to time to be prompted to try to plug them in as the conversation progresses, or at the end, if there's time for a Q&A after we've finished speaking. So, the first question isn't a question so much as an introduction. I'd like each of the panelists to take turns to tell us about who you are, the work you do, and how it relates to your relationship to this place called the Downtown Eastside. And I've asked the order to be the first round, Doris, then Justin, and Chris. So Doris, please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Great. Thank you so much. Good to be here. Thanks, everyone. I'll keep my intro short because I'm not that interesting. My name is Doris Chow. My Chinese name is Zhao Mo Yi, and I am first generation Chinese Canadian, first generation born in Canada. And my parents are from the Guangdong province, from a village called, my father's side is from a village called Huiping, and my mother's from a neighboring village called Toisan. And my growing up, I was born and raised in Vancouver, haven't gone very far. My mom actually worked in Gastown in one of the old, as a seamstress in one of the old garment factories named Corette, for anyone who's seen that name before. There's actually still a commemorative kind of banner, hipster banner up there. And as a kid, I would come down with my dad to pick up my mom from work, and then I'd go upstairs into this giant warehouse where everyone would be, you know, finishing work, and all Asian women in the garment factory, and we'd head over to Chinatown to pick up our groceries for dinner. And so, you know, we kind of like, even though we didn't live in Chinatown and in the Downtown Eastside, we shopped a lot in the neighborhood, the Woodwards, you know, Army and Navy and all that. It wasn't until later on in life that when I was going to SFU and I did my undergrad in sociology and community economic development, that I was really introduced to the Downtown Eastside. And my first job was at United We Can, the bottle depot when it used to be on Hastings Street. Again, some of you may be too young to remember that. And the picture in the right corner there is actually within the first 2 weeks of my job. where we participated in the Bitters Olympics. And I'm pushing Gina in a shopping cart racing Sean Dory, and he's pushing Steve, who's often commonly referred to as Mouse. That was where I really got delved deep into this neighborhood. And I didn't go very far for the next 14 years. I worked for 4 years at United We Can, working with bidders, learning about bidding life and forming relationships. And then I moved on to Soul Food Farm when it first started at the Astoria Hotel parking lot. And then realized I was really not cut out for growing food. It's way too much hard work. So I went into food security at Potluck, and now I am at Carnegie Community Center. And all along the way throughout my 14 years, I realized that and noticed that I was one of very few people who could speak Cantonese, despite the proximity and to Chinatown and the large population of Chinese seniors that still reside in the Downtown Eastside. And so wherever I went, whether it be the bottle depot, whether it be the urban farm, whether it be about food security or at Carnegie, I encountered a lot of Chinese seniors, and they've kind of come to know me through the years and follow me wherever I go. And I've formed a lot of relationships that way. More recently, I've started, my sister and I started a group called the Youth Collaborator for Chinatown, where we've been doing public space activation mainly, and Cantonese language revival, and really trying to maintain a sense of place in a very quickly gentrifying neighborhood in Chinatown. And I wanted to dedicate this time of me speaking here today to my grandmother, who lived in Chinatown for 15 years, the last 15 years of her life. And my sister and I, being primary caregivers for her, really formulated my perspective on some of the my knowledge and experience in the neighborhood as well, in addition to my work in the neighborhood. So anyway, I will leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Doris, for the wonderful story and the image as well. It's beautiful. I can't remember who I asked to go next. I have it written down somewhere. Justin, you're up.
Thanks. Yeah, I have also, sounds like, I still can't believe that we haven't crossed over more significantly when I talk to the other panelists here, because, or even with Jeff, because I think all of us have been very involved in the community for many years. And so it's kind of odd when there's someone who you don't know very well. It's more likely going to be the other way. But I grew up on Powell Street, above what is now Lana Lou's. It was called the New Era Social Club, with my parents coming in the 70s as immigrants, and my father coming from Japan and my mother coming from the US. And it was a artist commune-like environment there that I grew up in, and basically spent my entire life in the neighborhood since then. So the picture to my left over here is the old Oppenheimer Park playground, which we spent basically every day of my childhood over there. And it was that little ship was the greatest playground ever. Before they did this weird renovation at the park where these architects did these theoretical children's playgrounds. Really make no sense. Stick with the basics over here, and a good pirate ship, can't go wrong. But yeah, so I've been living and working in the community basically my entire adult life. I was with the Carnegie Outreach Program for several years, the Oppenheimer Park. I worked there in the early 2000s. And then now I'm in charge of supportive housing for MPA Society across the city. Even though I am a Japanese Canadian, I've always found my identity is much more related to the community. I my parents were not dispossessed. We came here voluntarily as settlers. And so I didn't really feel that connection with the Japanese community. And in fact, my parents, when deciding whether to put me into Japanese school or another school, they put me into French immersion because they thought it'd be much more useful. So I never learned any Japanese, and I've never really felt connected. And it wasn't until I ran into Kathy and Emmy recently where it was the first time where I actually felt really rooted with or connected to the community here. So it's been a great opportunity, and thank you for reaching out. And we'll get into this in a bit, but I think that there's so many intersecting groups in the community. It's kind of hard to say I belong to one group or I'm part of one, I have one identity, because there's so many amazing groups, and it would be a waste to say you're just part of one of them. That's me in a nutshell right there.
Thank you, Justin. Yes, Kathy does have that effect, doesn't she? Chris, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Livingstone. I'm also on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Thanks for inviting me to this. I hope that I can do you guys some justice. It's been a lot to take in, and setting the tone. For me, so I work at 161 East Cordova at a place called Smoke Signals. I'm wearing a t-shirt, but which is a peer-run place, and our mission is to connect street people to communities and to families and to services. So we've got a service directory that BCH has, and as well AMBAC has one of Aboriginal services, and we have phones and technology, and we try to do stuff for people, try to connect them to places and hopefully make their lives better. Old roots, I've been here for a while. Interesting story, 15 years ago, I moved from the Mary Gomez down on Princess Street over to Powell Street, the Ming Sun Benevolent building there, and I lived there for about 6 years. And right now I'm about to move back to Powell Street above the butcher shop that's there. So there's some kind of weird synchronicity going on with the Paueru Gai Dialogues, and maybe that opened up the place, but I'll be moving out of a BC housing place to there. So I've been in the community for quite a while, not as long. I had a 10-year break, but I started in 2002 as a street person, and living on the sidewalks and in the parks. I stayed on the Woodwards block for 9 months, and was one of the 6 elected negotiators for the Woodwards occupation, or we called it Wood Squat. And then in the following years, ended up moving. Even though I had a place, I still set up a tent at Victory Square. And since I sort of have a history of Tent City. But what got me into it back then was I was on the street, I was a user, I was homeless. I had no connections. I didn't know people. It didn't really matter what I was doing on the street until I was introduced to different organizations such as Vandu, Pivot Legal Society, the Anti-Poverty Committee back then. Actually in 2010, they thought I had stolen the Olympic flag, and CSIS had investigated all kinds of activists in the Downtown Eastside. I was one of those people, but I had already moved from activism into organizing, having helped form the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society, which does harm reduction and outreach patrols and support groups in the Downtown Eastside. I'm not sure how long you want me to go on. If you don't stop me, I'll just keep talking though.
I can pose the next question if you'd like, Chris. I think you might be first in the next round, and you can just keep talking. Actually, I've got Justin queued up to go first, but we can. I mean, I'm happy to switch it around if you'd like. But I'll put the question out there. So the second question is thinking about the long history of colonialism and of white supremacy that's been so formative in the creation of the Downtown Eastside. What are your own encounters with colonial, racist attitudes or incidents in your work or in your relations in the community or in the wider city of Vancouver? How does it manifest in real ways in the neighborhood? And I wonder if I could add to that. Certainly this past year has been a year that many will remember for a long time to come. And I know that the past year, a lot of this deeply rooted racism has bubbled to the surface. So if any of you can speak to that, that would be great. Chris, would you like to continue and then go back to Justin, or
sure,
pass the torch if you want to take a break?
Great. So I've got a story to tell. So back after Woodward's, the PHS had gotten the lamplighter and then the Stanley Newfoundland hotel, and so they had moved all the squatters in there. And right around the same time, we had started the guerrilla injection site, which was at 327 Carroll Street. So for people that don't know, we had, so Van Du and a whole bunch of people got together and started this place with Megan Olson was the activist nurse. And we had wars and First Nations people like myself, kind of, even though I wasn't an injection drug user, I would come out and hang out and chill out and just kind of make sure that everything stays cool. But one of these times one of the days that they were opening, I was walking through Gastown, and I stopped to tie I noticed my shoes untied. And so I kneel down and I'm tying my shoes. And while I was looking at my shoes and tying it, two Aryan people walked right up to me, and one on the other side, one on the left and one on the right, and they were wearing kilts with swastikas, and I was a young man and I didn't really think, but all I did is I let out this giant belly laugh. Like it must have echoed all across the street, primetime chicken across the street there. And these guys, they look at each other and they look at me, and the light turns green. So I start walking, and they look at each other and they start following me up Carroll Street towards 327 Carroll. So I'm walking and I get around the corner and this is just as it's opening. And thankfully there was like 15 volunteers there, all the people that were staffing that site, all the wars members, all the activists, all my friends and family at the time. So I just walk up to them. I didn't say a word, and I just turn around and I watch them coming. And they seen that I stopped and I was with the crowd, and they stopped and turned around and they gave up their pursuit of me. But I'm thinking, if I didn't have protection, what could have happened, and what continues to happen. Nowadays we've got COVID, and there's a lot of tensions that have come out, and I just hope that as a First Nations person that we're all thinking about how to be nice, how to care for each other, and how to not create those lateral violence, creating stress, creating lateral violence on each other is kind of playing into everybody else's or the colonized game. So I'm here to hopefully try and get myself out of that box, which I suffer from as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your comments on protection. I think that's an interesting theme that have heard on many occasions expressed by folks who live in the neighborhood. that it's not only a place where there is activism and organizing, but also protection, quite literal in the case of your story. So I would encourage the other panelists to reflect on the protectiveness of the neighborhood as well, perhaps, in your thoughts. Justin, over to you.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and there's the overt racism and white supremacy that you see, and that comes in the form of the police checks on the street when you see Black and Indigenous people of color who are disproportionately stopped and checked by the police, and that's well documented. And then you have the various racist behaviors towards the elder Chinese community in the neighborhood, and some of those. But there's also some racist policies that are a bit less visible. There were the things like if you look at Chinatown, or if you look at the city right now, they have this large movement in the past 10 years or so to have laneway homes everywhere, and you see laneway homes that have been growing across the city. Prior to the recent changes, the main place where you could only find laneway homes in the city was in Strathcona, and the reason for that was not because they thought that they deserved to have a better densification for the reasons we have them now, but it was a containment strategy, and it was to keep as many of the Chinese population into a smaller geographic region and not have them expand beyond the city. You also look at policies like the income assistance programs that are provided from the province, where again, we see disproportionate numbers of Black and Indigenous individuals who are receiving these supports, and they're clearly inadequate to the point where you have somebody who is that you're given $375 a month to find housing, which is basically impossible. And so that really creates a strategy of where the only access to housing is when it's coming through government subsidized homes. And in many times, the places that you can find $375 are these SROs, which are mostly in the Downtown Eastside, and then sometimes in other parts of the city. And then one of the last pieces on that note is in those few times when they have made social or supportive housing outside of the Downtown Eastside, there are these zoning requirements that you have to consult with the neighborhoods, and there has to be this planning process that involves feedback from the local neighborhoods, which are almost always these NIMBY groups who have the dog whistles of protect our children, it's too close to schools, or all these things. And these are all just coded ways of saying that we don't want these people in our neighborhoods. And there's plenty more, but those are the ones that jump out to me, that they don't, at first glance, it doesn't seem like a blatantly white supremacist group. These, like a person with a swastika, but they have the same effect.
Thank you, Justin. Doris.
Yeah. So this is one of the images that I had added to the slide here, and it's a headline in not that long ago from an article on The Guardian, and it says, "Race and Real Estate, How Hot Chinese Money is Making Vancouver Unlivable." And historically, a lot of the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment was around, the Chinese stealing jobs. And I think the more modern version of that now is that we're stealing homes. And although COVID racism, what a lot of the anti-Asian racism that's being talked about during COVID has been Asian in that sense of Pan-Asian. There is a growing specifically anti-Chinese sentiment that I have certainly felt in particular all my life. And I see it play out in the Downtown Eastside as well. You can't have a conversation in Vancouver without talking about real estate and housing and the housing crisis that we're in. And these kinds of headlines really use the Chinese as scapegoats, as this foreign or corrupt money that is coming in from China and Hong Kong, and these people in fancy cars and buying up extremely expensive houses and driving up the real estate, and that is what is causing homelessness in our community. And it's not unique to Vancouver. I went traveling probably about 8 years ago, and in Venice there was a tour going on, like a tourism company, whatever, holding a tour, and they stopped in front of a beautiful old building, very ornate. And I like to sidle up to tours to listen to how the tour leaders talk about their local neighborhood. I do that in Chinatown too. So I can say that's not what the history is. But anyway, so in Venice, they were standing in front of this building, and the guy said, this is the history of the building, and it has a lot of significance, and yada yada yada. And then, but the Chinese came and bought it, so they're buying up everything. And this is a global sentiment that is happening, and I have particularly when working in food security, and I know that this isn't a surprise to anyone that works in the neighborhood, there are tensions in the food lineups. And what I hear often is that there's a perception that, oh, if you're Chinese, you don't need free food. You're rich. You have families, you have homes, and so you don't live in poverty. And this idea that that there's these rich Chinese people really obscures the real poverty that is experienced by the low-income community in the Downtown Eastside, this segment. And it's very painful and very frustrating, because you're constantly trying to battle against that. And so these global dynamics and these global politics that are going on, and that have nothing to do with the senior living in an SRO, still impacts them in our own neighborhood. And this idea that, and it's, a lot of it is couched in this model minority myth that was born in the 60s, where an American sociologist wrote an article in the New York Times saying that Japanese Americans were successful, industrious, exceptionally law-abiding, and at the same time portraying Black Americans as a problem minority group. And we see this sentiment and this identity being adopted all the time and being used to justify incredible harms to Black and Indigenous peoples. And it's this strange place to be. It's a very strong tension that exists. And I see that play out in the neighborhood all the time. It's, I don't know.
Why do you think, Doris, that it's so difficult for people in wider Vancouver to see what's often right in front of their faces in terms of seeing the poverty, that some people face in Chinatown and elsewhere in the city, versus the very invisible kind of specter of this so-called Chinese foreign investment in the, like, why is that? Why is there that sort of discrepancy in people's perception?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, anytime we see things portrayed in the media, it's always about the Chinese are coming. And there's always, you know, how much more expensive can the next mansion be that's being outbid by a foreign person, you know? And that's all we ever see in the headlines. We don't see that there are Asians who face homelessness, who are couch surfing, who live in SROs too. We don't hear that, and it just continues to uphold this idea that that is used against other communities, and it's not fair. It hurts people of all BIPOC people. Yeah, and I would say even during this COVID crisis pandemic, there was no. I hope no one from BCH is here, but even the vaccine strategy completely ignored that, you know, there's a vulnerable community that needs language access and specific culturally sensitive care when we're talking about getting to vaccines. And it's like fighting tooth and nail to try and have BCH even recognize that there's this community here. I used to, because, you know, I mentioned earlier that I'm one of a handful of people who work in the front lines who can speak Cantonese. And when I used to work at Potluck in food security, I would network with a lot of the different food provider organizations, and they would always say, like occasionally they would contact me and say, oh, we have all this tension happening in the food lineups. There's starting to be violence. Some of the seniors are being pushed, and we think it's a language barrier. And I would, and oh, can you come in and, you know, help mediate? And one, it's not my job. I do not work at your organization. I don't just fly around to different food lineups to mediate conflicts. And two, my constant, you know, advice was always, how about hiring someone who could speak the language, or like getting volunteers to help manage the food lineups that can speak the language. And so it's not always, you know, seeing Chinese people on the receiving end, that they're giving back as well, and they want to. And sometimes the response was, well, we can't afford that. We can't afford to hire a Chinese person, or we can't afford it. It costs you just as much to hire a white person than a Chinese person. It always boggled my mind. And so it continues to perpetuate. And even just that basic language access isn't there.
It seems that we're really getting at this issue of representation, whether it's the media or the public health authority. Justin or Chris, what are any thoughts from either of you around this issue of representation from the community in terms of how issues are getting framed, what stories, what voices are being heard or neglected?
Well, yeah, I think I was experiencing the same story that Doris was talking about, and I would see this on a daily basis when I was working at Oppenheimer Park, and there would be the food lineups that would happen by various groups, and there would inevitably be the scenario where there was the elder Chinese who were waiting in line, and then other people who were waiting in line, and they would see this group, and they were, you know, usually were a tight-knit group, so they would be there in a row, and eventually people would be yelling at them and screaming and calling them all kinds of names and saying that they didn't need to access the food, or they were taking advantage of the system. And it was always so bizarre, because they clearly did need the services. They were living in the Downtown Eastside like everyone else, but there was this overt racism against, especially the Chinese population. And yeah, hearing those stories around that, or you know, the considering how big of a population there is in the community, and the lack of representation in the services that are down there. There's a few in the sense of that are kind of larger organizations, but it's true what Doris is saying, is that you don't see the services match the recipients. And whether that's the Chinese population, whether that's folks with lived experience who are providing harm reduction services, or any of the services from some of those organizations, whether it's Indigenous staff in organizations, you don't see the representation in many of the organizations that are down there. And yeah, when you do see it, it works much better.
Well, I hope that we can get to in the next parts of the conversation about things that are working well, or things that can be done to make things work better. But I'll give you another chance here, Chris, to maybe say a few words around this thread around representation.
Well, I was thinking, is it representation? I was just thinking about the free food lines. We do a food bank as well at Smoke Signals, and what we find is that, and we have got mostly Chinese people are going through our lines, and we have produce and milk and meat and stuff, and which is great for them, because what we find is sometimes street people, or if you're on the street, you have no way to actually cook something, right? So we're able to separate things that are like ready meals, that we get those to the people that can't cook, and then produce and groceries, it just goes out on a table. And we try to keep it random. We don't have a set time. We don't like people lining up, and we fill a table, and once it's gone, we fill it up until all of our stuff is gone. And it has worked out good. We do help at another lineup at Carnegie with the Korean church, who does a food bank there. And sometimes they make them wait, and that's when the violence starts happening, when people start grabbing stuff off tables. And I'm thinking about, so we're in a dialogue with the Powell Street, and I'm thinking about the as a First Nations person, or as an Asian person, the commonalities of the effects of the colonialization. So everybody in Canada has taken turns at being interned. Japanese people, German people, Austrian people, First Nations people, and then that colonization all around the world. And now I'm thinking about now where we are is basically in corporatization, corporations, crown entities. I'm hoping that maybe we could all get together and try to explain to like the federal government or the transport ministry that they can make lands above trains available for housing. They can give those lands back to First Nations people and to organizations to share, that we can be able to provide homes and services. Everywhere across Canada, we're playing their game, or the game of colonialization and capitalization. And I'm just hoping that we can get rid of that box and take away those things that people need. If you're on income assistance, that shelter money is going to a landlord. So who's really the benefit of that money? It's going to be the person that already has the money. It's not the person that's homeless, or the person that's looking for better lives or better connection. But yeah, I just think that if we could start thinking about things as not people's, and not be so connected to saying that land is mine. How many people have bought into that illusion that they can own land in Canada? how many people do they continue to invite to this day to buy our corporations, to buy our lands, to expropriate our stuff? And I don't see First Nations people benefiting from it, and I don't see Black people or Asian people benefiting from it. So something wrong is happening, and I'm hopefully the COVID and the overdose crisis, these are commonalities where we can all get together and activate and make these changes that need to happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. I really like your idea about the housing on over the trains. I think there's a certain poetic justice considering the role of trains in the CPR and the original land dispossession. If we could somehow prioritize that land as what ought to be returned and put to better purposes than what it's been used for the past 100 and some odd years. I'm going to move us on to the next topic. And Justin, I'm just noticing, I hope I didn't mess up your photos because I'm seeing them appearing on the next slide. But the next question is really getting at this idea of that I tried to express in the context around working across communities. And I think that our panelists have brought this up in some of the examples. But one of the things that I've heard over the years in the Downtown Eastside, an expression that some people sometimes use, is the idea of the 5 founding communities, acknowledging Indigenous, Black, Chinese, Japanese, Canadian, and rather the ubiquitous low-income community that makes up the majority of residents in the Downtown Eastside today. So each panelist, I'm wondering if you could speak from your own experience. How do you relate to this idea of these distinct communities that are tied to experiences, histories of race and racialization? Which community do you focus on and why? Are there any disadvantages to thinking in this way about these distinct communities, or advantages or disadvantages? The order I have here, I messed up with the last round, so I might mess it up again because Chris, you're up first, but I think what I'll do is go Doris, Justin, and Chris this time, if that's okay. Yeah, Doris. Keeping you all on your toes.
Okay. Yeah, I think for me, the first thing that I thought of whenever I hear that string of race, these 5 founding communities, it kind of obscures the interrelationships between the many groups, and 2 years ago, so the image I have here is a banner from the Chinatown Through a Wide Lens, a book that was written and a project led by Catherine Clement on this photographer named Chow. And the book was released in 2019, and it centers around this Chinese photographer who owned a commercial business in Chinatown in 1906 through to 1949. And he was Chinese, and he owned a business in Chinatown. But he was one of the few commercial photographers that was willing to take photos of non-white customers. And he chronicled the lives and moments for early Sikh and Hindu immigrants, Black residents, mixed race families, Indigenous families, newly arrived European immigrants, and all these through Catherine's journey. It was a 10-year project to uncover these photos. She just noticed these common backgrounds in all these different photos, these family photos, she did a big exhibit with featuring a number of these photos that people just had in their homes. And the stories that came out were just phenomenal. And it really highlighted the interrelationships that were in the neighborhood, in the Downtown Eastside. So they're not just, the groups aren't distinct from one another. All these communities thrived at one point together, and supported one another and spoke with one another, and And I think a lot of what happens through this colonialism and white supremacy that we structure that we live in, and all these structures and paradigms, all these stories of interrelatedness are buried, and it's so hard to rediscover them and uncover them. And I thought it was just so beautiful to be able to see this project out in the open. And, you know, because when a group of us were fighting 105 Kiefer, a proposed development in the heart of Chinatown back in 2014, 2015, it was like a 3-year battle. But everyone was saying, oh, it's not, oh, you're so exclusive. You're trying to make Chinatown Chinese. And there's always this idea that the Chinese community is just trying to keep Chinatown for itself. And it's actually about all the spaces that people feel a sense of belonging in. And this book really exemplified that. So that's kind of, I feel like it has a really special place in like trying to uncover that. And I would love to see more of that, more of those stories. And even, you know, Jeff, when you were talking about SPOTA and the freeway fight, like it's always somehow, I don't know how, but eventually it's always like, oh, those Chinese families that were part of SPOTA. It was like, it wasn't just Chinese, it was multiracial. It was many different communities working together. And that's what I feel like is somehow like it's getting harder and harder to dig those up.
Thank you, Doris. And I have to say, just before we go over to you, Justin, I've been prompted by our organizers that we need to move along into our breakout group. So the next question really speaks to what Doris just described, which is the reality that much of the work that happens and needs to happen is really all about working across community. So to Justin and Chris, maybe just in your next round of comments, just thinking about not just this idea of distinct communities, but the importance of inter-community organizing, just describing some of your experiences and thoughts about that. So I'll go over to you, Justin, then Chris, and then I think we're going to have to move on.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think they do there's a good overlap there in the sense that, you know, to start, there's often the communities are separated by racial lines. It's one of the kind of default groupings that people will go into. You know, when immigrants come to a new city, the first group they usually find are those who are, you know, share their same culture. You know, if it was someone coming to Vancouver, you'd go to the Chinese Benevolent Society that fit your last name and you would join the group. Or if you were coming to Vancouver now, you would most likely find someone that looks and behaves like you. But that's just the first piece. And when members are given a platform or a space to get past that piece, that's where you see a lot of the creativity and a lot of the change being happened. You know, my experience was the Four Sisters Co-op, which is down on Powell Street, just past Main and Powell Street there. And in the 80s, or the 90s, it was a real hodgepodge of different people who were in there. There was there's large families from Honduras, there was single mothers, there was a real mix along racial lines, but them all being in this one space became this, well, several working groups on all kinds of different subjects, and they had spaces where they could work on. And what you ended up seeing as a product of that were some of the most progressive organizations or movements that still run today. The Blade Runners was created there. Laurie Krill started her movement over there. Kathleen Boyes did the the Neighborhood Housing Society. Wendy Peterson was there. These are all groups. Yeah, so the pictures are, I think, are on the wrong slides,
Yeah,
but so many of these movements were created when people were given a space to work together. And you'll see like groups like Vandu, it's not along racial lines anymore. These are where they find the commonalities, and they realize that there is a common bond, but also a common enemy. And when they can work together, it's the same thing with MPA Society that I work with, was created by ex-mental patients from Riverview who decided that the current psychiatric system was an absolute disgrace. And they came together and formed their own organization that delivered services the way they thought it needed to be delivered. And I think those are the commonalities, and those are the connections that are really important. And as long as you're given that chance to connect, then it can happen. But when people are fighting for survival right now, or being constantly displaced, you don't get that chance to have as much of a bond. So I think that where housing security, food security, income security, those things all intersect with these pieces right here.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, it's not that one begets the other, but these two things have to go hand in hand: the provision of basic needs and the opportunity to work together in solidarity. You can't have one without the other. Chris, we're going to give you the last word on the panel before we segue into the breakout groups.
Great, I'll be super quick. So since the pandemic has started, I've had the pleasure to witness and help sometimes work and organize with many different organizations, several different coalitions that are across the board in the Downtown Eastside. And some of the things that, or the biggest things that stand out is we like feeding people. We like getting them stuff like sleeping bags, tents, food. We like to help our own members, no matter which organization that you're from. So one of the things, so to me, it's like, can't we get something bigger? Something like as something that we, like an actual capital resource, like an orchard or a working farm or something, so that we can grow our own food to feed our own people. We can have a place where our memberships can go for respite, or we can get people that are in danger in the community out of the community. I just think that this is a great opportunity for us to create some resource sharing amongst organizations.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Justin and Doris, too, for bearing with us as the time flies when we're having fun, I guess. But I guess what we're going to try to do next is continue the conversation in some facilitated breakout discussions. In order for that to happen, I need to stop being the facilitator, because I don't know how that actually works. But I've also been told that now is the time to, before anyone who does need to leave leaves, to announce our next Paueru Gai Dialogue, the subject being the changing environment and humanity. Same time, 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, Saturday, May 22nd. That's just about a month's time from now. And so, Angela, am I giving it back to you to make this next step happen?
This is going to take organizers just a little bit of time to sort everyone so that the numbers are roughly equal. And when you arrive in your group, your facilitator will be there with you, but they're going to take a minute or two to make sure that everyone gets settled, and then they'll give you instructions from there. Anything?
I'm also reminded that I was asked to make sure, to announce that this is also your chance to go for a bio break. So you've got about a minute or two as Angela works her magic.
Hey everyone, welcome back. I assume I'm gonna, in the interest of time, just assume that everyone is back now. So welcome back from breakout rooms. What's gonna happen next, you will have all tried to facilitate discussion relatively quickly. Thank you to the facilitators for guiding that. But what's gonna happen now is we're gonna share the questions that we all attempted to arrive at in our somewhat short breakout rooms. But yeah, looking forward to hearing from everyone. And I think there's a set order. So I'll turn it over to PSF staff.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Emmy Cohen. I was in group 1, so thanks to group 1. That was an awesome conversation we had. And the question that I'm going to share with everyone is, can a strong focus on reconciliation and decolonization help bring all of our communities together?
Hi, I was with group 2. Thank you all for generating this question. One question that we had is, how do we stop the pipelines? How do we protect the land, water, or homes of current generations more than human, future generations, so that future generations can enjoy them? Thanks.
Great, thank you for mine, group 3, and I apologize that we got cut off. Not everyone had an opportunity to speak, but the last question I feel reflects what we were discussing. How do we pass on a culture of connection for future generations?
Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks to my group, group 4. Also had a great discussion, and our question is, I'll put in the chat, what kind of collaboration / organization do we need on a street level to create the kind of momentum where people from diverse backgrounds come together to be responsible for each other and work together for justice?
Okay, thank you for my group as well. Our question is, how do we ensure that conversations about the Downtown Eastside take place in the Downtown Eastside and with the people who live there now?
Our group's question is it's a 3-parter. The first 2 are short but difficult questions, and the last one is the long question. So how colonized are you? How racist are you? And if we are that colonized and that racist, then what truths and what actions reflecting our different emotions and languages can bring us together and lead us forward? I'll type that out.
Group 10, so Paul, Owen, Justin, Trisha, Minnie, and myself. And this question comes from Paul. And Paul, would you like to share the question?
I'm not sure if I remember it, but I was asking, what is it we say to people who just seem to be waiting for something to happen, who seem to be indifferent? How do we get people energized and involved so that it's, yeah, okay.
Our group's question came down to something, well, I'm gonna basically just infer it because we didn't quite get the chance to articulate one properly. But how can we differentiate our connection to the land as a space that's like subject to governance? So kind of thinking along the lines of a colonial space or Canada, from our connection to the land as a place that holds our memories, it holds our struggles, as a place that supports us and a place that we help to support in turn. Thank you.
So one of the, in our group, we had a question come up in the Dokana. Is it possible to do work in community and the community that the work that we're doing for our communities outside of the context of white society? So yeah, that's one of the ones that really came up for us.
I wish that my understanding is that the space stays open for as long as people want to stay. And so if you're feeling connection, if you're feeling like you want to keep hanging out, maybe, I mean, does the recording stay on too?
No,
So,
I'll stop recording.
Okay, so you can stay on this call if you want and continue to connect with people and hang out and maybe unpack some of these questions if you're interested. Until we all leave, they're gonna keep it going. So, yeah. Thank you so much to everyone. After party, exactly. BYO everything.